I know you. You're that jaywalking punk anarchist.
You're that jaywalking punk anarchist. Jaywalking punk anarchist.
Hello, this is the Radical Reviewer, taking a look at... what's that sound? Are you okay, bud?
Stevie Molly did a video about anarchism.
I saw that.
And it's really bad.
Yeah, I also saw that. I'm going to talk about it. Do you want to help?
Sure, why not?
Great. So, here's the Radical Reviewer taking a look at Stefan Molyneux and David Smith's review of Teen Vogue's article, Anarchy, What It Is, and Why Pop Culture Loves It.
With the rugged Midwesterner. Call me Ron, everyone else does.
As for the article itself, it's okay. It's not a scholarly source, it's a primer on anarchism for the readers of Teen Vogue, and for that, it's an okay introduction to anarchist ideas.
Something I want to mention, because it's going to come up later, is that the content of the magazine is aimed at people between, let's say, 15 to 21. It is not a scholarly magazine. And that's fine. That's not a criticism of the magazine. But knowing that might end up being useful in criticizing Molyneux. Or maybe not. We'll just have to see.
Now, for Molyneux and Smith's interpretation of the article, they are capitalist libertarian types, and they believe they are anarchists. We should note, however, that their position comes from fundamentally misunderstanding what anarchism means.
I don't think their analysis comes from a simple misunderstanding of anarchism. I think they understand anarchism specifically through the lens of capitalism. That's the problem with anarcho-capitalism, is that it's capitalistic first and ostensibly anarchistic second. And yes, I will frequently bring this up throughout the video.
Apparently, Molyneux doesn't understand what argument means either. Yeah, that is an argument. An argument is an exchange of diverging or opposite views. You, Molyneux, hold that you understand what anarchism means, and I hold that you do not. What I assume you meant, though, is that I don't provide much in the way of evidence for my claim? Well, that's the purpose of this video. Molyneux and his guest David Smith start out with some basic critiques of government. It's okay. It's still a fundamentally anarcho-capitalist critique, but the first 8 minutes are passable. And that quickly changes, though, when we start getting into the meat of their confusion. Molyneux states,
right? I think it was Bakunin who said, do I wish to get rid of authority? No. My cobbler is an authority on how to make shoes. My dentist is an authority on how to take care of my teeth. I don't want to get rid of authority. I don't want to get rid of hierarchy.
But this is a confusion of authority and expertise. Anarchists want to abolish authority, not expertise. As American Johnson states in How Would Anarchism Actually Work in Real Life Part 1,
anarchist societies would seek to eliminate all hierarchies unless they're proven to be absolutely justified and necessary. An example of a hierarchy that's perhaps justified and necessary might be the crew of a ship. Sailing is a complicated and dangerous endeavor after all, and out in the high seas it probably does make sense for the less experienced sailors to follow the directions of their more experienced shipmates for the purposes of safety and pragmatism. An example of a hierarchy that is unjust and unnecessary would be the way most coffee shops are run. At a cafe, there's no imminent danger. Nothing that happens at Starbucks is so pressing that the workers couldn't organize and run the business themselves through democratic processes. Even in situations where hierarchies are perhaps justified, anarchists would seek to flatten hierarchies and make things as democratic as pragmatically possible.
Then Smith brings up that old argument of fairness.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And it's not, and a lot of times you'll hear people on the left use the term fairness, right? Like this is what Obama used to love, say people need to pay their fair share. And it's look, the truth is that life is never completely fair.
Now, these arguments have been widely debunked, from Cuck Philosophy's video, Why Equality is Unhelpful as a Political Goal, to Anarcho-Pact's video, Marx and Engels Were Not Egalitarians. And even I argued this point in my review of the book Parecon. The point is this: anarchists are not ignoring or trying to iron out the fact that people have varied talents and innate abilities. But this argument will become more clear in a second. Let's keep watching.
I used to play high school basketball. No matter how hard I worked, I could never be as good as LeBron James. That's not exactly fair, but that's reality. And it would be far more of a violation of justice for me to somehow force LeBron James to share his salary with me, because people don't want to watch me play basketball.
Okay, let's watch an actual anarchist literally make this same argument.
Why should we reward people whose genetic endowment gives them some remarkable talent? Some, like Mozart, or like whatever it is that Michael Jordan has, which no matter how long I practice, I don't have, right? No matter how long I practice, no matter what training I go through, I can't produce what Mozart produced. So why should we reward that? Why should we reward bigger size? I think an anarchist would say we should reward, and here comes the value, effort and sacrifice. We shouldn't reward power, we shouldn't reward output, we shouldn't reward property. We should reward, remunerate, pay for what people put in the sense of the effort and the sacrifice they expend in their work.
See, we don't want to force people to equalize their output. No reasonable person is calling for that. What we want, as anarchists, is to recognize that remuneration based on a person's property holdings, or their ability to take from others through force and coercion, or even their innate abilities, is unjust, because remuneration for output is unjust. Instead, we want to remunerate based on need. Molyneux then goes on to make this point.
People can't handle that kind of power. People are corrupted by that kind of power. You know what's really utopian? Thinking you can hand that much power to a small cadre of human beings and have everything turn out well. That's utopian, and it's never worked.
And yeah, as anarchists, we absolutely believe that. But as real anarchists, that is to say, anti-capitalists, we also believe that power, such as owning the means of production or being a boss, is also giving power over others to a small group of people, and it doesn't work. It's like, Molyneux, you're so close to being right on this issue if you applied it to society as a whole and not simply to the state.
It's comments like this that are what I mean when I say that anarcho-capitalism is capitalistic first. Molly can't dismiss owning the means of production or having bosses, because if he did, he wouldn't have capitalism anymore.
Molyneux then defines capitalism.
Oh, how do we even begin to unpack capitalism and what people mean by it? So technically, capitalism is private property rights and free trade. That's basically all it is. And those are two sides of the same coin. Like if you own something, you have the right to trade it.
Now this is the crux of their flawed understanding, but they expound upon it later, so I'll address it then. From here, Molyneux goes on to argue,
they never seem to talk about government schools. That, I can never once, I've read, I don't even know how many of these kinds of articles, not once, Dave, have I ever said, ever read, the parents, you see, have no control over the schools because the parents are forced to pay for them through property taxes, and the students are forced to be there usually by laws, or at least an inability for people to have their kids out of them because the property taxes are so high and other taxes are so high. And the teachers' unions, they don't reflect the will of the parents or what's good for the teachers. They're just there to shovel money at Democrats and so on. Like, there's an inherently oppressive institution you went to, I went to, I bet you the writer of this article went to. There's a perfect example. The worker control of the means of production would be parents taking over the schools. And I've not once seen a leftist advocate for that, but that's the one we've all been through.
Firstly, Molyneux, you must not have been looking very hard. Many people on the left have critiqued schools. Michael Albert and Derek Jensen have said that schools only teach boredom and following orders. Paul Affier has critiqued education. John Dewey has critiqued schools and democracy in education. Many of the books I've reviewed address education. But his misunderstanding is deeper than this. As Chomsky has argued,
the possibility that the government is of, by, and for the people. That's impossible. It's an enemy to be hated and feared. Not that there aren't a lot of things wrong with it, but that's not what's wrong with it. From their point of view, is it has a big defect. It's potentially influenceable by the population and big enough to stand up against private power, and that's the defect.
Molyneux, your ardent desire to raise the flaws of the state above all else has caused you to misunderstand our ability to affect systems of power at different levels. The potential for public input in public schools is much greater than it would be through private ownership. Voting with your dollar doesn't work, especially when people with more capital want to keep the workforce uneducated and people with less capital want to be educated. This is Class Struggle 101. Molyneux, you either know this and you're being disingenuous, or you don't understand the very basic ways in which power works in society.
I would also add that we do have private schools, that private schools have problems admitting and disciplining people of color. A black girl was suspended a couple of weeks ago for having dreadlocks in a Catholic school in California. And the reason that our school system is doing so poorly is because the government isn't paying for it. It has nothing to do with teachers' unions. In fact, teachers are some of the most underpaid and overworked people in the entire country.
Then get to a wonderful, total misunderstanding from David Smith.
Direct democracy and consensus. Well, those aren't exactly the same thing. You're like, so what do you mean here? I mean, direct democracy, are you essentially saying we vote on something, and if you get 50% plus one vote, the rest of us are all basically just slaves to whatever you guys chose? So the other, say, 49% of us or whatever, we just have to go. So wouldn't that be authoritarian? You know, is that now imposed on us?
Mr. Smith, sir, do you have no idea what consensus means? Consensus is literally the opposite of 50% voting for one thing and everyone else being forced to go along. I'm not going to waste time explaining this to people who already know, but there is a plethora of material on how to improve voting to allow for the best possible proportional representation in decision making. Non-Compete has a video describing liquid democracy in the Borda account. CGP Grey has several videos on various voting systems. In fact, here, Molyneux, Smith, just for you, here's a bunch of videos on anarchist decision making. Links in the description. We then get to the classic communism killed 100 million people argument.
When they're talking about revolutionary socialism, to anyone who's had half an eye on the bloody heap of socialist victims throughout history, 100 million plus in the 20th century alone, I'd like to hear how you're going to bypass those pile of bodies.
You guys can't really be this dense. A, no. Check the census at the time, check with some factual sources. The Black Book of Communism has been widely disproven, you turkeys. And B, capitalism has killed how many people? Well, about 200 million people die a year from preventable diseases and preventable starvation due to capitalism's poor distribution of resources. Bad Mouse Productions has done a great video on this.
Not only is this argument reductionist for all these reasons, but it's also hypocritical. Take note that Molly says that some nebulous left want to associate the free market with oppression, which isn't entirely wrong, but it is wrong-headed. But then he goes on and literally conflates socialism and communism with oppression and mass murder. Like, no one is denying. Okay, no one who doesn't self-identify as a tanky is denying that there have been atrocities under governments that identify as socialist or communist. From Stalin and the Soviet Russia to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to the Kim dynasty and everything happening in North Korea. The difference between ANCAPs and ANCOMs is that we understand why these things happened. We know why they were wrong, and we know how to keep those specific circumstances from arising a second time. And it's so simple. You prevent it from happening by dismantling unjust hierarchies. When the people have power, how do you commit atrocities? Why would you commit atrocities?
We now go from the classic communism killed a gazillion people argument to the that's not true communism argument. Honestly, the bulk of this video is just stereotypical surface level arguments that I'm tempted to assume that they're made dishonestly, because I can't believe such arguments would be made out of ignorance. For the sake of fun, let's look at this argument this way.
The line that we all hear all the time is, that's not true communism.
This idea that what's going on right now is capitalism is just astonishing.
That's not true communism.
This idea...
That's not real capitalism.
That's not true communism.
That's not real capitalism.
That's not true communism.
That's not real capitalism.
That's not true communism. Okay, moving along. Molyneux then criticizes an anarchist vision statement.
They write on their website, and I quote, "We demonstrate a vision for a society in fundamental opposition to the brutal logic of contemporary capitalism, a society based on mutual aid, cooperation, and radical democracy." Okay. Do you want to make any arguments or demonstrate some proof or empirical evidence? Because vision doesn't really cut it in the realm of political philosophy. I've got a smoke this, man! It'll all become clear. I got a vision! Let's go! It's like, details? No, a vision!
Molyneux. Vision statements typically don't have sources. They're vision statements. From here, Molyneux moves on to making an argument that is one part misunderstanding basic economics and another part racism.
Everything Molyneux does is one part misunderstanding basic economics and one part racism. That's his brand!
Yeah, good point. Anyway, he states,
Really drives down purchasing power is, inflation, taxation, and endless amounts of immigrants who don't come to work, but generally they don't come for freedom, they don't come for free trade, they come for free stuff.
let's deconstruct this one part at a time. Inflation. Now, inflation does cause problems in society, but inflation's impact on our daily lives is not purely the cause of the government. It's a combination of government and capitalist forces. Okay, what about taxes? There are plenty of things that taxes go to that I disapprove of. Wars, bombs, prisons, police, the usual stuff. But there are other things that I do support. Things that, if I were to live in an anarchist community, I would support through social contract, such as research and development and education, maintaining infrastructure, etc., etc. However, all this misses the bigger picture. The fact is, taxes provide jobs, whether it's purchasing so many tanks that we sell them to countries hostile to the US, or putting 100,000 new police officers on the streets, as Bill Clinton famously said, or fixing roads and paying teachers. Taxes provide jobs for people in ways that capitalism will not or cannot sufficiently provide. And lastly, these immigrants and refugees just want free stuff argument is incredibly false. Many migrant workers pay into taxes for government services that they don't have access to. For example, it's estimated that undocumented workers pay $23.6 billion in income tax despite being unable to receive Social Security, Medicaid, or the Earned Income Tax Credit. So we can fairly state that these bozos have no idea what's causing wages to decrease. What do they think increases wages, I wonder?
Flip side to what you're saying, the other sides of that coin is what drives wages up, and there's really only one thing that does it, and that's increased productivity. It's capital investment, it's people coming up with better technology. Instead of using a shovel, now you have a big plow, now you have and now you're way more productive, and you can demand to be compensated.
And again, they're totally wrong. Innovation might mean costs go down, and that might help everyday people by making products cheaper. But under capitalism, innovation is often centered around cutting costs, primarily labor costs. Innovation under capitalism often means cutting hours and replacing jobs with automation. Now, this can easily be a good thing, but under capitalism, this definitely decreases wages, which decreases income. Also, side note, innovation is not purely a capitalist endeavor. Despite the arguments of these silly memes, it must be remembered that capitalism maintains itself by creating the biggest possible profits for their investors. For one, this means that capitalists aren't incentivized to increase wages or services for their employees, and in fact want to reduce those things as much as possible. I explained this in my review of the Communist Manifesto. But by the same token, it means that capitalists are disincentivized from investing in more risky projects like researching and developing new products or upgrading their infrastructure. Instead, capitalism relies on taxpayers for those things. Research and development grants, military and civil scientists working with government contracts and grants, radio, television, the internet, cell phones, touchscreens, numerous inventions created at taxpayer expense and then given to capitalist companies to profit off of. And these knuckleheads think that capitalist innovation is to praise. Molyneux then goes on to address property.
Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, generally recognized as the first self-proclaimed anarchist, and his theories continue to influence anarchist thought today. So he's the guy who came up with the phrase, property is theft. And because sloganeering is a whole lot easier than thinking, people don't actually go into the roots of this. So I'll give the context of this. So this is Proudhon's What is Property? He says, if I were asked to answer the following question, what is slavery? And I should answer in one word, it is murder, my meaning would be understood at once. No extended argument would be required to show that the power to remove a man's mind, will, and personality is the power of life and death, and that it makes a man a slave. It is murder. Why then, to this other question, what is property, may I not likewise answer, it is robbery, without the certainty of being misunderstood, the second proposition being no other than a transformation of the first. So the fact that in the context of the paragraph, he's talking about property and slavery would indicate that he's not talking about you having a toothbrush or a factory. So property, he's talking about this idea of land property that originated in Roman law, which is the right of the sovereign right of property, the right of the proprietor to do with his property as he pleases, to use and abuse, so long as in the end he submits to the state-sanctioned title. And he contrasted the supposed right of property with the rights, which he considered valid, of liberty, equality, and security. And so he's talking about a very primitive form of land ownership. And of course, remember, a lot of times when you're talking about primitive forms of land ownership, it's because you were really, really great at murdering people. And so the king gave you a bunch of land because you were a good general, a good soldier, a good Macbeth who didn't turn on the king. So when you gain a huge tract of land by being really good at killing people in the king's usually useless wars, well, yeah, I can understand how that's a kind of theft, but that doesn't have anything to do with the creation. And this is something foundational to the leftists that they don't really understand. Genuinely, and I've listened to professors, it's not a matter of intelligence, they generally and genuinely don't seem to understand, Dave, that stuff gets created. It doesn't just... land is there. So land is, I can understand the critiques of property as theft when you're talking about aristocrats having land. But a factory, a job, a business, it doesn't just, like a restaurant, they don't just pop into existence.
Did I just hear Molyneux say that he understands anarchism's critique of land ownership? Holy crap, what a breakthrough! But that doesn't account for the point of created property, particularly the means of production. Yes, Stefan, the means of production have to be created. But by whom? Who made the stuff? Dave Smith goes on to make the same flawed argument, admitting that land ownership is unfair, but claiming that owning the means of production is okay.
This argument that they make would make sense if, say, the world was just started yesterday and some god-like figure just had distributed all of the products and goods around in this certain way. Like he just gave, a billionaire and a millionaire, someone who owns a big house, it was just handed to them yesterday. Every business was just created by a god and then just handed to people yesterday. You could look at the situation and go, well, that wasn't so fair that this got distributed this way, and maybe we should redistribute it another way. But the reality of life is that everything, like you said, outside of, say, trees and hills and land, outside of nature, everything that you look at, like buildings and computers and electricity, everything that's man-made was created, it was thought up before it was produced, and then it was produced.
Again, I ask, who created it? Who made the stuff? I think this is where anarcho-capitalists especially misunderstand anarchism. So let's let Debunking straighten you out.
There is not even a thought or an invention which is not common property, born of the past in the present. Every new invention is a synthesis, the result of innumerable inventions which have preceded it in the vast field of mechanics and industry.
David Smith then further misunderstands the property issue.
You can't have any piece of property without somebody getting to act in the way that an owner would act. The question is really just what we're concerned with is the just acquisition of property.
The answer is trivially simple. Your right to the land does not supersede my right to the land. So how do we decide who gets it? This is where having some democratic structures comes into play. Anarcho-communists understand that to claim any one individual or group owns a piece of land is to steal the land. Hence Proudhon's quote, "Property is theft." Or to quote Michael Parenti, "The fruits of the earth belong to everyone. The earth itself belongs to no one." We then come to the article's definition of anarcho-capitalism, and here's what our commentators have to say.
Anarcho-capitalism, which is interested in self-ownership and free markets. It's just a fetish, man. It's a fetish, it gets McCrank going, like Wonder Woman in a cat suit, I'm just interested in it, that got my attention. No arguments, no facts, no historical analysis, no syllogisms, just interested. It says anarcho-capitalism, which is interested in self-ownership and free markets, is much rarer and is considered by most anarchists to be illegitimate because of anarchism's inherent opposition to capitalism.
Couple notes. Not only do they skip over literally every other sect of anarchism and go straight to anarcho-capitalism, but the only part of the description of the anarcho-capitalism that they actively object to is that anarcho-capitalism is considered illegitimate by most anarchists.
And David Smith adds,
our principle is non-aggression and private property rights. Okay, so our principle is it is morally wrong to bring violence to peaceful people.
But guys, this is where your ideology falls into basic contradiction. The individual's right to own property or the means of production is in fact theft of something that's collectively owned and produced. And this is aggression. This is the theft of collectively owned and produced resources by the individual. The basis of capitalism is aggression and violates the non-aggression principle.
This goes into what I was talking about earlier. Anarcho-capitalism can't reckon with the harm it does, because then the philosophy falls apart. A person could do an entire video about how the NRP, as they describe it, would necessarily lead to oppression. I should do that.
Molyneux is able to wait an entire hour before invoking the specter of Hitler and claiming he was a socialist.
And they consider fascism to be on the right, which is wrong. Which is wrong. Hitler hated capitalism.
But this argument is just hilarious at this point. There are literally dozens of videos debunking this myth from different angles. Check out the book Fascism and Big Business, or Black Shirts and Reds, or these videos, which will also be linked in the description. The reality is that Nazi Germany was closer to classical liberalism than to socialism. In fact, classical liberalism tends towards fascism, a point made very well in Radiant to Pi's video, Why Classical Liberals Decay into Fascism. So, Molyneux and Smith, please watch those videos. They then continue down their explanations of anarcho-capitalism.
Anarchists oppose the state as much as they oppose self-ownership and free markets. That's a very confused philosophy. Like, I strongly oppose, they say, I strongly oppose both the initiation of the use of force and the non-initiation of the use of force. I strongly oppose violations of property rights and property rights. Like, if I don't have the right to property, I don't have the right to life.
Alright, at this point, I feel like I've disproven these arguments to death. So here are some YouTubers who have debunked anarcho-capitalism. Links again in the description.
Also, I'm going to state something that seems obvious to me. He doesn't seem to be talking about real anarchism. He's talking about anarcho-capitalism. It's a matter of framing. If his audience believes that anarcho-capitalism is a default anarchism, then they'll believe that it's the only legitimate anarchism. To quote Ollie from Philosophy Tube, some of the people are nodding their heads and saying, "Oh, it's Wednesday. I get it."
Molyneux and Smith then do the fascism is bad but communism was worse argument.
But the way that fascism is discussed compared to the way communism is discussed. And it's quite something where the crimes of the communists have been completely whitewashed from history, and the crimes of the fascists are like right front and center. Like everybody knows, you ask someone who the most evil person ever was, it's Hitler. Hitler's the guy who gets it. Even though like Mao Zedong killed way more people and Stalin killed probably more people, and certainly communism in general is responsible for more death and starvation and destruction than fascism was.
Okay. See Killing Hope. See On the Justice of Roosting Chickens, or Confessions of an Economic Hitman, or Sword in the Dollar, or Overthrow, or dozens of other similar books. Capitalist, imperialist countries have been the aggressors, and this history is widely known and documented. Molyneux then claims that communists won World War II.
Communism won the Second World War. There's no question of that. If communism won because the reputation of communism not only did not suffer, but you've got tens of thousands of outright communists as academics in America.
The Red Army was instrumental in defeating the Nazis. Something like 4/5 of the war casualties were on the Eastern Front. But he then draws a line between that and the communist movement of today. He ignores 50 years of imperialist history from the US. The Red Scare, the wars against communism in East Asia and Central America, the fall of the Soviet Union, etc.
And there's a reason that he does that. If Molly were to genuinely analyze the reason more people, especially young people, are finding socialism and even communism more appealing, he would have to confront the failures of the capitalist system that he necessarily supports. And capitalism is failing them because it's designed to fail them. Capitalism makes the rich richer. It doesn't do anything for the poor unless the state forces it to.
Molyneux then addresses a common critique of capitalism, namely that it destroys communities, and concludes that diversity, taxes, and feminism destroy communities.
One of the big criticisms that leftists have of the free market is that somehow it destroys community. It's like, no, diversity and taxes destroy community. Feminism destroys communities by destroying families.
Oh my god! Oh, my ears! What is that ringing sound?
This This isn't even a dog whistle at this point. It's known white nationalist propaganda. There's a link to a lengthy video about how white nationalists use diversity as a scare tactic, titled Reading from the Right Volume 2, Cultural Marxism, in the description, because it's thorough.
From here we come to a pretty standard critique of democratic control and anarchist decision-making in general, that it will be bureaucratic and bogged down with excessive voting.
Even some anarcho-syndicalist, communist, anarchist, whatever, where you've got to get together for direct democracy meetings like 9 times a day. Oh God, can you imagine? Can you imagine like what a nightmare that would be?
But it's not as though decisions about things aren't currently being made. Decision-making already takes place under capitalism. But we call these processes meetings, conferences, focus groups, surveys, etc., etc. The difference is that under capitalism, it's a very small amount of people making those decisions and imposing them on others. Also, as I pointed out earlier, there are several other ways to address voting to allow for participatory collective input into society. If you've forgotten, or you didn't look them up when I gave you the chance the first time, here they are again. The video ends with half an hour of Molyneux and Smith congratulating each other on how principled and consistent they are, and how the left isn't principled or consistent.
The last 20 minutes or so are the most enlightening part of the video, in my opinion. I could talk for hours about how Stefan Molyneux conflates anarcho-communism with white nationalism, or how he seems to think Trump dislikes executing power, or this ludicrous notion that Trump can just order the army to construct his ethnic cleansing wall, presumably out of excavated copies of E.T. for the Atari 2600. That's literally the most wrong thing he says in the entire video. But there's one thing I think is more important to understanding the video than anything else. It's at about the 1 hour and 18 minutes in. I wrote it down. That's how I take notes. And American Barry Goldwater says that he does not use complex language to explain his ideas to people who aren't familiar with them. He's analyzing a primer essay from Teen Vogue, aimed at 15 to 21-year-olds, as though it's a peer-reviewed scholarly article, while explaining that if he were talking to, say, a 15 to 21-year-old, he would eschew complicated language and terms in lieu of a simplistic primer. He literally describes the thing he is doing himself as brainwashing, more than once.
Wow, Ron, it sounds like Molyneux is either unable or unwilling to engage in the more advanced texts and philosophies that he opposes, and that makes any analysis he may have of those philosophies uninformed at best and blatantly dishonest at worst.
I was gonna say it sounds like a cult, but that works too.
So there you have it. Dave Smith and Stefan Molyneux stand for individual liberty and private property, yet they seem to not understand that we are social creatures. They don't understand that all is and has been created by all, and that property ownership and owning the means of production cannot be achieved without aggression. They hold a flawed worldview of the atomized individual, and therefore they do not understand anarchism. If you're interested in radical theory, looking for a book recommendation or whatever, you can get your radical reviews here with the Radical Reviewer. Thanks for watching. That's not true communism.
That's not real capitalism.
That's not true communism.
That's not real capitalism.
That's not true.